I very much appreciate the invitation to speak. And so I'll go ahead now and share my screen, and then we can get started. Okay. And just do this. Okay. Now, without further ado, let me put this into slideshow mode. Would go from beginning. There we are. Okay. Okay, so the myths of the Amazons have sparked the curiosity of human audiences for nearly 3,000 years, since the days of Homer. These fearless women, who dared to challenge men on the battlefield and live without them, have defied the imagination of some and inspired awe in others. In the 1980s, while classicists were asserting that the Amazons were an imagined other using a structuralist approach, lesbian feminists in the United States were co-opting the Amazons as their forebears, as they defied patriarchy and decided to live without men in a fashion that became known as lesbian separatism, a fashion like the Amazons. These women even adopted the labrys, the double-headed axe associated with the Amazons, as a symbol of their movement. And here we see some labrys jewelry, which is very popular in the lesbian community. And here we see the lesbian pride flag, which prominently displays the labrys in the center. It was used in the Serbian pride parade in this photo. Transgender activists, I should note, have also seen the Amazons as their ancestors, so to speak. In many retellings of the myths, the Amazons are compared to men and even thought of as men in a sense. Such Greek lore led one author, Leslie Feinberg, to include the Amazons among their collection of transgender warriors, published in 1996 and 1997 for the paperback. In this lecture, I would like to examine issues of gender and sexuality in the various legends of the Amazons, as promised by the title of this talk. In so doing, I will operate on 3 levels. First of all, I will discern what the ancient Greeks tell us about the Amazons, and I think that's most important for the talk today. Secondly, I will point out why these myths make the Amazons appeal to feminist, lesbian, and transgender communities. Finally, I will briefly examine the historical reality that seems to lurk behind the Amazons, the cases of more historical Thracian, Scythian, and Sarmatian warrior women, although I'm going to focus on Thracian and Scythian peoples today, in so doing for the purpose of time. In the book, I do look at the Sarmatians. In so doing, I will argue that while there may be some historical basis underlying the myths of the Amazons, and I think that there is, we need to understand the myths themselves as preserved by the Greeks as imaginative texts that problematize normative binary Greek understandings of gender and sexuality. Let's begin with the name Amazon. It literally means breastless. The alpha privative, or the A in English, means without, and matzon is an Ionic variant of mastos, the Attic mastos, or breast, at least according to a fragment of Hellenikos of Lesbos, which has been preserved by a scholiast or a commentator. And so this text is not extant except in this fragment preserved by a later author. So the scholiast writes, and I should stop here and say that I have provided both a handout, but I've also put the Greek and the English translations on the screen. And so Joanna was going to distribute the handout through the chat, I guess. Is that right, Joanna? Yeah, okay. And so, but you can also see it on the screen if you don't have the handout. So this is handout number 1. And the scholiast here writes, quote, Amazons are so called because they cut off their right breast in order that it will not be in the way when they shoot a bow. This is false because they would have died from it. Hellenikos and Diodorus say that they cauterized this spot with an iron object before it began to grow in order that it would not grow. Of course, one would not need to cut off a breast to shoot a bow, as we know from the modern Olympics, where women participate in archery. Additionally, in ancient Greek art, Amazons are displayed with breasts, both of them, as we see in this well-known statue of the wounded Amazon, housed today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. She is otherwise known as the Lansdowne Amazon by art historians. As I have noted in my book, Post-Colonial Amazons, Female Masculinity and Courage in Ancient Greek and Sanskrit Literature, a word such as Amazon, which literally does mean breastless in Greek, might be an epithet that conjures up notions of masculinity in women, even if the said woman does have breasts. Amazons fought and hunted, tasks normatively assigned to men in ancient Greece. Regardless of what the ancient Greeks thought, the myths we have received from them take on new meanings in a contemporary context. For example, one transgender theorist, M.W. Bykowski, has compared the breast removal undergone by the Amazons, as described by Hellanicus, to gender-affirming top surgeries undergone by those who transition from female to male, otherwise known as transgender men today. Bykowski writes, quote, "While Amazons play a role in the history of strong and or butch cisgender women, they have a more genealogical connection with the trans men than previously imagined," end quote. Of course, cisgender here refers to someone who does not identify as transgender, as in particular women who might identify as lesbian, for example. At this juncture, I'd like to explore how and why such connections might be made to the ancient Greek. Although the Greeks grammatically gender the Amazons as women, the evidence of Lysias, a 4th century Athenian orator, does perhaps inspire what we today might call a quote-unquote transgender reading. And this is your handout number 2. And Lysias writes, "The Amazons were the daughters of Ares in ancient times, who lived beside the river Thermodon. They alone of those dwelling around them were armed with iron, and they were the first of all peoples to ride horses, and on account of the inexperience of their enemies, they overtook by capture those who fled, or left behind those who pursued. They were esteemed more as men on account of their courage than as women on account of their nature, or phusis. They were thought to excel men more in spirit than they were thought to be inferior due to their bodies." The Amazons, according to Lysias, were esteemed more as men on account of their courage than as women on account of their nature, right? So courage, epsukia here, right, as opposed to nature or phusis. But in the next passage, in a typically Greek fashion, Lysias tells us that the Athenians, and only the Athenians, put them in their place by defeating them, thus determining that they were indeed women, although that seems to be in doubt thus far, but here we go. They ruled over many nations, and they had indeed enslaved those living around them. But having heard a report of the great glory of our country, for the sake of their own great reputation and in high hope, they gathered together the most warlike of peoples and marched against this city, that city being ancient Athens. Having encountered valiant men, the Athenians, that would be, however, they found that their spirits were like to their nature, and I think by this he means sex, and they earned the opposite of their former renown, and more from their perils than from their bodies they were deemed to be women. Now, Lysias' ultimate gendering of the Amazons as women is similar to what we see in other Greek literature, right? In Homer's Iliad, the Amazons are also grammatically gendered as female, but they are called anti-anaeri, or the equals of men. Both references to the Amazons in the Iliad are brief, but follow a similar convention in their grammatical construction. And this is your handout number 3. The first of these references is a flashback where King Priam of Troy relates a past event to Helen. Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships and that caused the Trojan War. But this is really a flashback that has nothing to do with Helen, but does have something to do with Priam. So Priam says, "Once I went to Phrygia, rich in vines, and there I saw numerous Phrygian men with galloping horses, the armies of Otreus and godlike Mygdon, who were then camping near the banks of the Sangarius River. I had chosen to be among the allies with them And it was on that day that Amazons, the equivalent of men, came. The phrase Amazones antianeri, or Amazons, the equivalent of men, leaves no doubt that the Amazons are women. While the term Amazones, according to Risch, is a loan word that can conceivably have been a masculine noun, it is modified by the compound adjective antianeri. It is unusual for a compound adjective in Greek to have a feminine ending, and the meaning is thus clear, right? The Amazons are women, but they are women who are the, quote, equals of men, end quote. The second reference to the Amazons in the Iliad is even briefer, and again, with no context of which to speak. It is from a battlefield speech where Glaucon relates the deeds of his ancestor Bellerophon, and it's very short. And Glaucon says, Homer says, right, in the speech of Glaucon, third, he, Bellerophon, killed Amazons, the equals of men. Here the phrase Amazonas antineros is in the accusative plural, but the construction is still the same. A noun, Amazonas, clearly modified by a compound adjective with a feminine ending, antianeros. This term antianeros could also be a substantive, but here it seems to be an adjective. It's working as an adjective. Once again, the meaning is clear. The Amazons are a group of women without men, right? If it weren't for the adjective, we might think of this as an ethnic group that in Homer could include men, but it's pretty clear, right? This is a group of women without men, and it's because of the adjective and the feminine ending of the adjective that we know that. Thus, writing several hundred years later, Aeschylus, in the Suppliant Women, labeled the Amazons as anandroi, or manless. When the suppliant refugees, the daughters of Danaus who have killed their husbands, claim Argive heritage, the suspicious king of Argos rattles off a list of women whom he might have suspected them of being, had they looked different. And again, this is sort of a completely different context of the play, but we get a very brief mention of the Amazons. And so the king says to the suppliants, he says, certainly I would have guessed that you were the manless and androus, carnivorous, creoborus, right? There's a mistake there. Amazons, if you were armed with bows. And this sentence, without any further context, as in Homer's, suggests that the Amazons were hunters, as they are bow-carrying and meat-eaters, creoboros. The adjective anandros, according to the Liddell Scott and Jones lexicon, the standard lexicon, used to translate from Greek to English, may refer to husbandless virgins or widows. Here, the former seem to be the case. These are women who, we learn from piecing together sources, live without men at all, but they may just be women who live without men, don't have to be virgins, as we'll see in just a minute, right? They do procreate in unusual ways. We are not told how the Amazons came to be a single-sex community or ethnic group by Homer, which is obviously exceedingly rare. We did have an ethnic group of women only. Homer gives us no further context than what we've just read together. It is only from later sources that we learn about the origin of the Amazons. According to the 4th century BCE Greek historian Ephorus, quote, the Amazons were treated insolently by their husbands, and when some of the men went to war, the Amazons killed those left behind and refused entrance to those returning from abroad. Afterwards, we are told by Pompeius Trogus, right, who was writing much later, that the Amazons had no desire to marry again. And Pompeius Trogus writes, quote, they, the Amazon women, had no desire to marry their neighbors at all, calling this slavery, not matrimony, end quote. And this quote of Pompeius Trogus is preserved by an even later author, Justin. So, this is late. I think it's important to mention that, right? But regardless, as they had been treated so insolently, right, this should not surprise us that they did not want to remarry. Of course, Pompeius Trogus wrote in the 1st century BCE, much later than Ephorus. and Justin even later than that, but the story he tells is similar. As single women par excellence, the question arises as to how the Amazons procreated and replenished the population of their tribe without husbands. So according to the geographer Strabo, who wrote around the time of the Emperor Augustus in the 1st century AD, the Amazons met up once a year with neighboring men to copulate. And Strabo relates that, quote, others, not Strabo himself, but other authors, among whom are Skepsis of Metrodorus and Hippocrates, say that the Amazons dwell in lands bordering on those of the Gargarians, in the northern foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, which are called Caronian. And they spend the rest of their time among themselves. But they have 2 chosen months in the spring, during which they go into the nearby mountains that separates them from the Gargarians. Strabo continues, the Gargarians also go up following an ancient custom, and they sacrifice together and have intercourse with the women to beget children secretly in the dark, the men having sex with whichever woman they chance upon, and having impregnated them, they send them away. And if the child is female, the women keep it, and if it is male, they return it to the men to raise. And each man to whom the child is given considers it his own due to the uncertainty. So very strange customs indeed. Now, aside from this time that they spend with the men, for the rest of the year, Strabo, quoting others, relates that the Amazons lived independently of men, farming, raising horses, hunting, and making war. But Strabo himself casts doubts on these stories, however, when he emphatically uses his own voice to say, and this is number 9 on the handout, for who would believe that an army or a city or a race of women could have ever existed without men? But this is kind of late in Greek antiquity when we're getting this. This is the Roman period, Strabo living during the time of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. And so, right, I think we want to keep that in mind. Earlier Greeks, I think, did believe their myths and probably did believe the myth of the Amazons. But we should note here, right, given Strabo's doubt, it is perhaps not surprising that by the time of Strabo, a new version of the myths of the Amazons had already emerged, as recorded by the historian Diodorus Siculus, who wrote in the 1st century BCE, just before the time of Strabo. Diodorus tells us that the Amazons were not a nation of women only, but rather women who took the place of men in an inverted society, at least from a Greek perspective. According to Diodorus, the Amazon women hunted, fought, and farmed the land while they forced the men of their tribe to do domestic labor. And this is slide handout number 10. Diodorus writes, and now along the Thermodon River, there is a dominant tribe ruled by women, and the women, just like the men, take up military service. Over time, however, one of the women, Queen, drilled the other women into a formidable fighting force and placed the men under the yoke of the women once and for all. And this is handout number 11. Diodorus continues, quote, to the men she assigned the wool spinning and other household duties of women. She also introduced laws on account of which she led the women forth into the contests of war, while she bound the men in humiliation and slavery. With regard to their offspring, they mutilated the legs and arms of the males, rendering them useless for the pursuits of war, end quote. It should be noted here that the spinning of wool was a task normally assigned to women in ancient Greece, as were other household chores. In contrast, men trained for war, generally speaking. Now, there is one exception to this preserved by the biographer Plutarch, which is the Spartan women. Spartan women threw javelins and engaged in wrestling and other physical sports like the men, at least according to Plutarch. But they are exceptional in this regard. We don't hear this about other Greek women in other Greek cities. In a much earlier fragment of the 4th century BCE author, Hellanicus of Lesbos, going back to Hellanicus and going back in time now, we glean another interesting version of the Amazons and procreation. In this fragment, preserved in the medieval Byzantine Tsetses post-Homerica, we are told, and this is handout number 12, right? Quote, of the historians, Hellanicus says, quote, the Cimmerian Bosporus having been frozen over, the golden shield, silver-axed, man-loving, that's Philandros, male infant killing, Arsenobrephicotonos, enormous host of the Amazons, having crossed over it long ago came. So in other words, this is a bit of a clunky translation, but the Amazons cross over the frozen Cimmerian Bosporus. This is the narrow strait of water between what would be Russia today and Crimea. And in so doing, then they're able to march around the Black Sea to Athens, where, as we heard in the earlier quote of Lysias, they attacked the Athenians. What I think is of interest here, right, is this idea that the Amazons are man-loving, Philandros, right, but also male infant killing. And so the word Philandros is often translated with respect to wives as husband-loving. But with regard to Atalanta and the Amazons, can be defined by the standard Greek English lexicon of Liddell, Scott, and Jones as meaning, quote, loving masculine habits, end quote. Yet in the same passage, the Amazons are defined as Arsenobrephicotonos, or male infant killing. In my 2016 book, I translated these two terms as man-loving, yet male infant killing, thus asserting that it must mean that the Amazons had sex with men, which of course would be necessary to procreate, but killed the male infants and raised only the females. What I missed in my 2016 book was the fact that Philandros might simply mean, quote, loving masculine habits, end quote, according to the standard Greek English lexicon by Liddell, Scott, and Jones, who cite a fragment of Sophocles, where Atalanta, another masculine woman hunter in Greek myth, is called Philandros. This translation might make more sense and could negate a reading of the Amazons as man-loving, which flies in the face of other evidence, particularly a passage of Aeschylus' Prometheus Bound, a tragedy, in which the host of Amazons is called Steuganor, or man-hating. In the passage, as with many references to the Amazons that we've read today, and most of them, in fact, their mention is in passing. Prometheus is in this passage that I'm about to show you is giving advice to Io, telling her in which direction she should go. Now, let me just give some background. Io was the daughter of the king of Argos. Zeus wanted to have an affair with her, and either Zeus turned her into a heifer, or his wife Hera, who was insanely jealous, turned her into this heifer. And poor Io, as a heifer, was then chased by gadflies sent to her by Hera, who was jealous of Zeus, the king of the gods, having an affair with her. And so she's on the run. And in this passage, right, she's told by Prometheus where to go, basically, right, in a good sense, how to escape. He tells her, quote, you will need to pass over the peaks near the stars and head upon a southern path where you will come to the host of the man-hating Amazons, and they will most gladly guide you. Okay. And so this word Steuganor means man-hating in ancient Greek. And here the Amazons are called man-hating, but Prometheus notes that they will be friendly to Io, a woman, thus guiding her on her journey. Since the Amazons are here called man-spurning or man-hating, it is perhaps not surprising that they might be thought to have been homoerotically inclined women, the ancient equivalent of lesbians. Prior to Diodorus, in the 1st century BCE, they were considered to be part of a group of women who lived without men. They did not even raise male offspring, but only girls, and they were man-hating, right? They either killed the male offspring that they had, or they gave them away to the men who'd begot them, right? In several versions of the Met that we've seen here, right? Our only other evidence to answer this question of whether the Amazons might be thought of as proto-lesbians or homoerotically inclined women comes from Greek vases. This is a white-brown alabastron, a perfume container, a drawing from one, I should say, in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And it shows a courtship scene between the Amazon Penthesilea, shown here on the right, and another woman, Thrikme, who is dressed like a Maenad, a follower of Dionysus. And these wild skins tend to be an attribute that signify a follower of Dionysus in iconography. Although, as we'll see, Amazons can also wear wild skins, as can Heracles. But in any event, right, Thericme, who is dressed like this Thracian Maenad. Maenads were thought to be from ancient Thrace. I'll show you a map in a minute, right? But that's somewhere near Istanbul today. She gives Penthesilea a hair, which is presumably a gift, right, of courtship. And this is important, right? In courtship scenes found between males on Attic vases, such as this red figure kylix or drinking cup, now in the Louvre. This is a gift of choice where the Erastes, right, who is the lover, the older male in the Greek homoerotic relationship, gives a hair, as we can see here in the middle, to his eromenos, or beloved, the younger partner. And you can see here the Erastes has a beard, whereas the eromenos does not, right? That kind of signifies the difference between them. Again, a marker of difference, which is often important on these pots. This is red figure, and I should stop here for just a minute and explain that red figure pottery comes after black figure, although they overlap for some point in time, right? This is from 480 BCE from the Museo Nazionale Etrusco di Villa Giulia in Rome. And and so in any event, red figure vases start being produced around 530 or so BC, and we see black figure vases much earlier in the 6th century BC. In any event, right, on another vase owned by the Bibliothèque Nationale, right, de France, two embracing Maenads offer a hair to Dionysus, most probably as a sacrifice. I'll come back to that other slide in a minute. So here we can see, here are two women that are embracing, right, and what some scholars have thought to be homoeroticism. And here is the god Dionysus, right? And they're offering him, and there are inscriptions that tell us who this is, right? This is Dionysus, we know, because of an inscription here just above his head. And they're offering him a hair, right? And does this relate to their homoeroticism? Well, hard to say, right? But when we compare it to this particular vase, right? And this is the white ground alabastron from the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And here you can see the vase in its original context. Here you can see the drawing that has been done from the vase because the depiction wraps around. So you would have to look at multiple sides to see it. And it's also kind of in bad shape now. But this drawing was done in 1923 by R. de Mangel. And again, right, we can see we have an association between this hair, right, an Amazon and the Thracian Maenad. And it would appear perhaps that even though she's dressed differently than the Maenads in this particular representation, right, they're dressed more like what you would see a normative Greek woman wearing, a long skirt, right, a long chiton, which comes down to the ankles. There may be some sort of link here, I think, between the homoeroticism and, because they're together offering this as a sacrifice to Dionysus, right, and, perhaps a blood sacrifice, right, but how do you represent that on the pottery, right? Well, here they're just giving it to him. So I think that, there's some significance that maybe they've given each other the hair and now they're sacrificing it to Dionysus. Okay, right. So the only other possible iconographic evidence of which I am aware is found on a red figure vase now owned by the Louvre. And I'm grateful to Nancy Rabinowitz for bringing this to my attention years ago. On one side of the vase, Amazons are disrobing, as we see here, right? So these are clearly Amazons. And notice they're wearing a short chiton, right? And a short dress, right? Which is what men would wear in ancient Greece. And on the other side of the vase, right, Amazons are bathing, right? The presence of an eribolos, right, which we see here, this tiny vase that this woman is holding, right, which is an oil flask in the hand of one of the women may suggest erotic activity. But scholars disagree on this point. Kilmer notes that bathing scenes are generally of an erotic nature, but finds this particular scene to be lacking in said eroticism. Rabinowitz, on the other hand, notes that there is no internal male viewer, and the women seem content with themselves. Certainly, this is a homosocial scene, as Rabinowitz has convincingly argued, with women only. But should we call it homoerotic? Well, I think that's hard to say, right? The oil and the nudity might suggest that it's very rare to see women naked on ancient Athenian vases. And so men, yes, we see them naked fighting, right? But, you know, when women are shown naked, their scene could be some erotic connotation. It's hard to put ourselves into the mind of the vase painter. But in any event, right, as I have noted above, in Greek literature, the Amazons are clearly defined as women, but masculine ones at that. Nevertheless, because the Amazons are either called men in some fashion or another, as in Lysias, or equated with them, as in Homer, the myths have appealed also to transgender activists. And while vase iconography has only a little to tell us about the sexuality of the Amazons, it tells us much more about the gender of the Amazons, much more we can discern, right? But again, we're left guessing sometimes what it all means. First of all, Amazons are almost always depicted fighting, which by the Greeks at least was seen as the domain of men. Secondly, Amazons are depicted wearing men's clothing. So let's take a look. On a black figure vase now owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, an Amazonomachy, this is a battle between a Greek, here Heracles, right, and Amazons, 3 Amazons. Amazonomachy means a battle between Amazons and Greeks. It's a Greek word, an English derivative of a Greek word, right? Here we see an Amazonomachy, between Heracles and 3 Amazons depicted. It is a fairly common theme on Greek pottery as well as in temple reliefs. In this depiction, there are no inscriptions, but we can tell that the male is Heracles by a number of his attributes. First of all, in black figure pottery, which, as I mentioned, predates red figure, although there's some overlap, right? In black figure pottery, which was prevalent during the 6th century BC, earlier in the 6th century BC than the red figure, men are depicted with black skin. You can see Heracles' face and his legs are black. The women, on the other hand, are depicted with white skin, right? The Amazons have white legs, white faces, right? And so what we can say is that skin color here tells us about gender or sex, perhaps maybe better said, right? Not ethnicity or race. Secondly, the male figure is wearing a lion's skin and holding a club. Here he's wearing a lion's skin and at least I thought he was holding a club, but it may be more of a spear, right? But often he's holding a club or has one with him. Maybe that's it there, but yeah, that may be it there. Okay, in any event, right, Heracles in Greek text is described as fighting Amazons, in particular Hippolyta and her sisters as one of his labors, which is to obtain the warrior belt, or sometimes translated incorrectly as the girdle of Hippolyta. In any event, right, we don't see inscriptions here, so it's hard to say exactly what's going on. But what we can say is that the Amazons here wear clothing, right, that is similar to Heracles. So particularly this Amazon, right, whom he seems to be getting the best of in the fighting, right, is wearing a short tunic, right, the top of which we can't see, right, because she's also wearing armor and a helmet, right? But these are all masculine or male attributes or male pieces of clothing, right? Look at Heracles. He's also wearing the same tunic with the same trim. Although his, you can't see the top of because he's got this lion skin over it or over most of it. You might see a bit of it there, I think, right? The other Amazons have slightly different outfits, but again, they're wearing short tunics, right? This Amazon seems to be running away, right? But this one is in for the fight, hopefully to take on Heracles, right? As her sister is being killed. Okay. Now, as I mentioned previously, Greek women wore a long chiton that came down to their ankles, as we saw in a previous slide, whereas Greek men wore a short item of dress which fell above the knee, right? We'll talk about pants as being a barbarian, what the Greeks called barbarian item of dress, which came from the northern part of the world in Greece, which was warm, right? Especially during the summer, men wore dress-like garments, as in other parts of the Mediterranean, and shorter garments than men typically, right? Okay, and secondly, the Amazons on the right side, at least, are wearing helmets and a type of body armor known as a breastplate or cuirass, right? These are also items associated with men. In the reliefs from the mausoleum, which are quite a bit later, dating to circa 350 BCE, the Amazons wear a short chiton, and this is more of a flowing garment, right? We can see here this Amazon on the right, which is male clothing. Even if it may look like women's dress to us, it's not. Although these reliefs may once have been painted, today the paint has been worn off. Okay, that said, we can differentiate between the Greeks and the Amazons based upon physicality. The Amazons have breasts. You can see the breasts on the Amazon here, right? And the Greek men are naked, and this is clearly a male, right? Revealing their bodies and probably originally their genitalia, but that doesn't seem to be have survived the ravages of time, right? Once again, Amazons appear to have both breasts, but they are dressed as men and engage in masculine pursuits, fighting. The Amazon on the right appears ready to strike the Greek, who cowers below her, but her weapon has been broken off of the relief. And one thing I want to stop and say here is that usually the Amazons lose in Greek literature. As we saw with Lysias, they're defeated by the Greeks, if not by other kinds of men, right? And other ethnicities of men, I should say. But in reliefs, right, there's usually a pitched battle going on. And sometimes the Amazons have the upper hand, as we see in this, in contrast to the vase that we just looked at, right? The Amazons here are winning or in a pitched battle, and like this is one slab of many, and so it's more of a pitched battle between the two. But we get a somewhat different view from the artwork than we do from the readings of Greek texts, and I think that's important to note. Amazons appear on Greek painted vases starting around 575 BCE, again, originally on black figure vases. And as we noted already, they're distinguished by the color of their skin, white, in contrast to the skin of the men. And here we can see this is Heracles, right? There is an inscription here, right? This is Andromache, right? And here we can see a Greek Telamon, right? And so forth. Another Amazon over here. That's a little bit harder to make out. But sometimes there are subtle differences in outfits, as we see on this vase from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston by the Timiades painter. The Amazon's outfits, in contrast with that of Heracles, right, have some differences, right? First of all, in the helmets, right? So here we can see the Amazon's helmet is somewhat different than the helmet of the Greek warrior here. These are both Greek helmets, right? But they're different helmets from different cities. And okay, right. Also, the Amazon here wears a short chiton, right, or a short tunic, I should say, right? It's not the flowing chiton, but it's a short tunic. And similar to, looks like Heracles is wearing a tunic that is white here, right? But hidden under his skins again. But what's different here is that her tunic has markings on it, right? And this is a pattern that we can see on longer chitons in other Greek vases. And so here the Amazon is presented again as masculine, but as a woman, clearly based on her skin color, right? The white skin, again, signifying that she's a woman. She's wearing armor, including these shin plates, right, to protect her shins, right, and her shield. In any event, right, give me for just a second to catch my place here, right? Okay. And so, the Amazons have attributes and, helmets that are similar to what the Greeks have, but these seem to vary, I think, to distinguish them somewhat, right? And the same can be said for the wild skins worn by Heracles, as they are sometimes worn by Amazons, such as Penthesilea, which we'll look at briefly later. Such skins might seem to indicate barbarian status on Penthesilea, for example, an Amazon, right? Non-Greek status. Again, we'll look at that in a minute, meaning both non-Greek and wild, but Heracles is Greek and is represented in similar fashion as a bit wild, right? The patterns vary, but thus far, what we have seen is indicative of the masculinity of the Amazons. They wear similar clothes and often fight with the same weapons as the Greeks. From a Greek perspective, they are masculine women, right? Thus far, we have explored Amazons wearing Greek male outfits and sporting weapons and shields that are Greek. Starting around 550 BCE and with greater frequency thereafter, Amazons begin to appear with Scythian and Thracian attributes. This is perhaps due to the fact that among the Scythians and Thracians, there is evidence of historical women warriors. Scythia would be the modern Ukraine today. Thrace would be Bulgaria and that European part of Turkey. In any event, right, why do we see Amazons ultimately being dressed as Scythians and Thracians? Well, I think it may be, in fact, due to the historical reality that there is evidence of historical warrior women among the Scythians and Thracians. There are women buried with weapons. Right, I do not wish to equate the Amazons with these historical warrior women, but rather to suggest that a relationship may have existed between them. Now, let's just stop and think for a minute. Myth is often a way for people to understand the natural and the physical world around them, things that they don't understand. So the Greeks didn't understand lightning. So what they thought lightning was that the god Zeus became angry and he took his javelin or spear and he hurled it down upon humankind, right? Striking them. And so that's a way that the, phenomenon of lightning was explained through myth, right? In Greek texts, Amazons tend to show up in places like Thrace and Scythia, where historical warrior women lived, but they are described as mythical beings, the daughters of Ares, whose lifestyle is often not just in marked contrast to, but an inversion of Greek norms. In other words, the Greeks mapped the Amazons onto more historical warrior women, perhaps, in the same way that they mapped Zeus's spear onto lightning. Whereas Adrian Mayer has argued that the Amazons were Scythians, end quote, and I see the relationship as far more complex, although I think there's something to what Mayer is saying. I'm not entirely arguing against that, but I think it's more complicated, right? I do think that the Amazons are loosely based upon the idea of historical warrior women, but are a Greek way of understanding these women as semi-mythical beings, right? With many exaggerations. And to her credit, Mayer does note that there are exaggerations in the legends of the Amazons. Warrior women, we now know from archaeological findings of women buried with weapons, existed among not just the Scythians, but also among Thracians and Sarmatians. But I'm going to focus on the Scythians and Thracians for today. So it is of interest, right, that Amazons in Greek literature show up in the places where these historical warrior women lived and were buried with their weapons, namely Thrace, Scythia, and Sarmatia. So here is Thrace, or Thracia, as it's shown on this map in the Greek, right? Scythia, right, or Scythia, as we would say in English, is up here. This is where the Ukraine would be. There's Crimea. There is the Cimmerian Bosporus that I mentioned earlier. And over here is Sarmatia in what would be modern Russia today. And the association of Amazons with Thrace shows up in some of the earliest Greek literature, the Aethiopis of Arctinus. And this is important. Arctinus wrote around 700 BCE, right? And so before we see these painted pots, but unfortunately, his text is now lost, but a summary of it was preserved by Proclus in the 5th century AD, so sometime later. Proclus writes, and this is number 14 on your handout, the Amazon Penthesilea, a daughter of Ares and a Thracian by race, arrives to assist the Trojans as an ally. Achilles kills her as she acts heroically, and the Trojans bury her. This is of interest because we see Penthesilea both being called an Amazon, and a daughter of Ares, but also as Thracian, right? And so Thrasa de Totgenos, right, in the Greek, right? Thracian by race or birth. And so does that mean she was born in Thrace, right? But, or does it mean she has a connection to Thrace? Is she ethnically Thracian? Well, I think it's hard to say. You could argue it in different ways. But what is of interest is that the scene of Achilles killing Penthesilea is illustrated in what's thought to be one of the best examples of Greek vase painting by Ezekias from around 530 BCE. And here we can see Achilles killing Penthesilea, right? He's about to stab her in the neck with a spear. And what's of interest here is Penthesilea's outfit, right? She's wearing a leopard skin. Which, as we've already mentioned, could be associated with Thrace, right? And Thracian maenads, right? As we can see on this volute crater from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where these leopard skins as well. Right, and this is a little bit harder to see. Here is the god Dionysus on this sort of center right, and here you can see the maenads, the women followers of Dionysus, excuse me, and here you can see the satyrs, the male followers of Dionysus with their tails and their sort of half human, half beast creatures, right? And in any event, Alan Shapiro has convincingly argued that the leopard skins associate Penthesilea with Thrace on this vase. And first of all, we know from Proclus that Penthesilea was thought to be a daughter of Ares, yet also of the Thracian race. Secondly, the maenads, or the followers of Dionysus, also came from Thrace. We know that from other texts. And are depicted wearing the leopard skins, as we've already mentioned, on this volute crater now housed at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Perhaps the most easily identifiable attribute that is associated with Amazons is the pelta, or the Thracian half-moon shield we see carried by two Amazons on this amphora, which an amphora is a storage jar from Munich. And here you can see these Amazons. This is, again, black figure pottery, which means the white identifies these as women. You can also see they do have breasts. And you can see the pelta, or peltai, right, in the plural. These are half-moon shields. These are Thracian, right, and not Greek. And they're also carrying some spears. And so this identifies them as Thracian. Again, right, what we learn from the pottery, right, helps to solidify what we've learned from the texts. On the reverse side, additionally, we see two Thracian men. Again, there are no inscriptions on this pottery, nothing to name them as Thracian, but the men are wearing Thracian cloaks, which are called zairai, right? A zaira is a pattern cloak. In this, you can see this interesting pattern here, right? And this male rider, notice these are men because of their skin color, right? Which is black, again, indicating maleness, not race or ethnicity. And you can see he's also wearing a zaira, even though the pottery here was broken. And it's been, you can see, glued back together. It is important to note here that the women and the men are dressed differently. The women do not wear Thracian cloaks. They wear these kind of short tunics like we see Greeks wearing. But they do carry the Thracian half-moon shields or peltai. Now, as mentioned above, the Amazons are also associated with Scythians. Whereas Lysias, writing in the 4th century BCE, tells us that the Amazons attacked Athens alone of their own accord, Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, asserts that they did so as the allies of the Scythians. And this is number 15 on the handout. Quote, when the Scythians had allied themselves with the Amazons, indeed a powerful force worthy of mention had been mustered, with which the leaders of the Amazons crossed the Cimmerian Bosporus, marched through Thrace. In the end, having advanced through much of Europe, they came to Attica, where they camped at the place that is now called after them, the Amazoneon. And this is where later we're told by Plutarch, the Athenians would sacrifice to the Amazons, which is interesting, right? Sometimes they would sacrifice to their enemies or their defeated enemies. In any event, so they are with the Scythians, which is of interest. Of course, this is much later, but as we'll see in a minute from the pots, we can see earlier on the vases that there are Scythian Amazons. But let's begin, right, first of all, by looking at some maps, right? Here we can see, I guess I lost my map. Where did it go? Anyway, I think I seem to have lost the map. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Where did it, forgive me. Well, anyway, I seem to have lost the map I wanted to show you. Here we can see, oh, no, this is the one. Okay, I'm confusing myself. Forgive me, right? Themyscira is down here. This is in modern Turkey, ancient Asia Minor, Anatolia. This was considered to be the original homeland of the Amazons. This is ancient Scythia up here. On the legend here, we can see where are women grave sites that are found along the Dnieper River and in this area as well. There are actually more graves over here as well that aren't shown on this map. This is an older map from 1999. But the story of the Amazons moving from Themyscira to Scythia, or the modern Ukraine, from Turkey to Ukraine, was also preserved by Herodotus, but he tells a somewhat different version of it. What he tells us is that the Greeks captured the Amazons and were going to take them back to Athens this way, right, through the Bosporus and then through the Aegean Sea down to Athens. But what happened is the Amazons mutinied on board and they killed their Greek captors, which is one of the few times, I think the only time in Greek literature that the Amazons actually defeat the men, the Greek men, but there is one instance. And then they don't know how to sail the ships. You know, they're horse riding women, right? And warriors, right? And so they wind up just floating along and they wind up, instead of coming home because they don't know how to sail, they wind up in Scythia. And there they end up marrying the Scythians and forming a new tribe called the Sarmatians. among whom we also find burials of warrior women over in this area. In any event, right? In terms of thinking about Amazons dressed in Scythian outfits, let's first of all look at a male Scythian archer on a Greek black figure vase, now in London at the British Museum. Scythians were known as excellent archers and were even hired by the Greeks mercenaries for such skills. Here we see the Scythian archer with a quiver used to hold arrows, right? Here we can see his bow, which is still inside the quiver, right? And here he's holding what might be an arrow or something else. I think it's an arrow, but I'm not 100% sure, right? And we can also note that his outfit is quite different from that of the Greeks. He is wearing leggings or pants and a tunic with spots on them. Now, in this red figure vase, also in the British Museum, we see a Scythian archer in a similar outfit, but with a slightly different cap, which is rounded. See, and it's got these kind of what are called dog ears, and the cap here is rounded. I must note here that the pants were developed in the northern parts of the world because they keep one warmer. They are more practical for riding horses in colder climates. And now let's turn and think about Scythian Amazons. On this red figure vase now in New York, which dates from circa 440 to 410 BC, we see the Amazons fighting Greeks, although we can only see one Greek in this view. He is here, right? Notice the difference in his dress. Right? He's wearing a short chiton, typical Greek dress. Sometimes Greeks are represented nude when they're fighting, which would not be practical, right? This is either a chiton, but this actually could be a form of armor, sort of a leather, kind of skirt, as it were, that's more practical for armor than a sort of flowing garment, right? But nevertheless, short dress, right? This is male, and he's wearing some sort of a cuirass, right? The Greeks also used a kind of armor that's something like modern Kevlar, made of linen, pieces of linen that were, glued together and made a very thick cloth that an ancient arrow could not pierce through because they weren't as sharp as arrows are today. In any event, the Amazons here, right, are fighting the Greek, and we can see the Amazons here in a Scythian outfit, right? This Amazon's in a Scythian outfit, but she is holding a pelta, a Thracian shield. So we can see, again, a kind of mix and match sort of thing. But the Amazons here, the other Amazons are wearing similar outfits, but with more tunics that kind of flow a bit over them, but still short, right? And she seems to be wearing a tunic as well, though it's harder to see in this depiction. The Greek male warrior holds a traditional shield, a hoplon, right? And he's engaged in hand-to-hand combat with this Amazon wearing Scythian dress, whose breasts, as we mentioned already, are apparent. While the dress of each Amazon varies somewhat, each seems to be dressed in a Scythian outfit. The central Amazon, however, does not engage in archery, but uses a sword to fight and holds, as we've mentioned already, a Thracian shield or pelta. Regardless, it is tempting to say that in comparison to the male Scythian archer, the Amazons here are wearing male Scythian clothing. The problem that arises with such a reading, however, is that we know very little about Scythian women's dress. Whereas Herodotus provides us with a description of Scythian male dress consisting of tall pointed caps and pants. And here we can see that tall pointed cap, right, on the Scythian archer, right? No such description of Scythians' women's dress is found in Greek literature, and the Scythians themselves did not leave a written record behind. Analysis of frozen tombs in Siberia may help to unlock the mystery. At the Siberian site of Pazyryk, the clothes of nomads buried there have been preserved by permafrost. At Pazyryk, young women are buried wearing trousers, which may indicate that they were warriors. Older women wear robes or skirts over leggings. Of course, Siberia is far from the Scythia that the Greeks knew, right, which is roughly in the same spot as the modern nation of Ukraine. And the Greeks had colonized the shores of the Black Sea, and so that they would have come into contact with Scythians is without a doubt. The only evidence from Scythia itself with regard to women's dress is a gold plaque depicting what is thought to be a goddess. And here we can see her. She wears long flowing robes and what appears to be a long dress-like garment. Burials of Scythian women with weapons found in the Ukraine do not contain clothing as they have decayed. Greek iconography of Amazons on the vases, in turn, seems to use a mix and match approach where Amazons wear various outfits, some Greek and some Scythian, with Thracian attributes thrown in here and there. So then, what are we to make of all the evidence surveyed here today in conclusion? If we solely examine the Greek literary evidence, we learn that, from a Greek perspective, Amazons were understood to be the equals of men, women who either spurned men or who ruled over them in a society that was a polar opposite of Greek norms. It is not surprising, given the stories of Amazons living separately from men and using them only for purposes of procreation and otherwise being stouganor, or man-hating, that they were adopted by lesbian feminist separatists in the 1970s and 80s as their forebears and prototypes. And the idea that Amazons were women who were called the equals of men obviously has an appeal to feminists and has had such an appeal. When we expand our inquiry to look at Greek vases, we also understand why transgender activists have been drawn to the Amazons. In ancient Greek iconography, the Amazons wear Greek men's clothing and fight in the manner that the Greek men fought. But vases that depict Amazons as Scythians complicate this picture. Are Amazons wearing Scythian pants and using Thracian shields depicted in men's dress? Perhaps not. They certainly engage in a pursuit that is male from a Greek perspective, and from that lens may be seen as transgender in a certain light. And I risk anachronism here, using the term transgender to refer to the ancient Amazons, but I'm also interested in the reception of these myths. As I've argued here briefly today and elsewhere in my book, the Amazons seem to be both an imagined other, the mythological daughters of Ares, but have been loosely other to the Greeks, I should say, but have been loosely based upon more historical warrior women found among ancient Thracian, Scythian, and Sarmatian peoples. Archaeological evidence from these peoples seems to suggest that young women may have been taught to fight as a matter of course, and thus their fighting would not be necessarily transgendered, right, from a more historical perspective. As we have no written records generated by Thracians, Scythians, and Sarmatians, we can only begin to guess how such warlike women were perceived in their own societies. But it seems to be more normative for women to fight. These are questions that I have addressed in more detail in my book, but due to the limited time today, I have tried to limit my inquiry to the more mythical aspects of the Amazons. That said, I am happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.